He smiled as if she were a curiosity. "Scholarship students, right? We'll try not to overwhelm you with the theory today." Sofia felt the words like a breeze that didn't touch her. She smoothed the strap of her worn backpack, where it had thinned to a pale braid from years of tugging. The sound of the professor's laugh folded into the hum of the lecture hall. Air conditioning clicking, laptops clicking, the soft scrape of pens. Someone behind her snorted. Tago's smirk said it all. She did not look up to meet his gaze. She never did when the room offered a stage for other people's performances. Instead, she read the board, worked the problem on paper, and kept her hands steady. Her notebook lay open on the desk, its first page ridged with the stamp of the admissions office and the date she would not let herself forget. The day the scholarship arrived. That date had been a promise between two people who worked with their hands and protected each other against the world's small cruelties. In the mornings, before the campus filled with branded cars and confident shoes, Sofia moved through a quieter, less flattering version of the same place. She met her mother at the west entrance, Vera pushing her cleaning cart like a cart of small, honest rituals, polish, spray, cloths folded in a neat stack. The smell of lemon disinfectant followed them down the tile corridors. Vera's hands were knuckled and reliable. She carried pride in the way she tightened a cloth around a rail after someone had left fingerprints of haste. Sofia watched her mother with a tenderness that had nothing to do with pity. Vera rose at dawn. Vera left the radio on low for company. Vera once ironed Sofia's first uniform until the creases looked as if they might fold into the future itself. On the morning the scholarship letter arrived, Vera had sat at the kitchen table with her fingers around a mug and cried noiseless, furious tears. Tears of income stretched thin and gratitude that tasted like money and courage braided together. Sofia tucked that day into her chest like an amulet, and read it again when she was afraid. Campus was a place of contrasts. Marble floors reflected glass and corporate logos. At the same time, the janitorial closet smelled of bleach and hope. There was a path that led from the cleaning supplies closet at the back of the humanities building to the polished atrium where donors had their lunches. Sofia knew both spaces intimately. She knew which vending machine never broke, which bench collected warmth in winter, which stairwell hummed with conversations meant to be private but not secret. On good days, she hummed with it too. Inside the classroom, Professor Flavio had a voice that worked like a tool, confident, practiced, cutting where required. Older men in positions of authority often had built lives on expectation that leaned toward particular kinds of students, particular pedigrees. He said things that floated like bees, just beyond polite conversation. A small joke about scholarship students, a side comment about real experience that landed every time as if on cue. He watched reactions like a man who had long ago learned to rule the temperature of a room. Sofia knew how to measure heat. When a complex problem appeared on the board that day, it was almost a relief. Numbers were impartial. They insisted on neatness. She wrote through the question without thinking of eyes or whispers. The solution came like a line of birds taking off, natural and inevitable. She spoke it aloud because she had no other language for what she knew, and because saying something made it more than proof to herself. It made it witnessable. "Lucky guess," Flavio said after he had heard her. He turned the phrase into a dismissal, the word like a cloth thrown over an object he preferred not to honor. He walked to the board and began to erase the chalk, slow, deliberate strokes that removed the evidence of her thought, as if to nullify its existence. The chalk dust fell in a thin grey rain onto the tray. He erased. She watched each stroke, as if it were a small theft being committed in public. Later, during a group assignment, Sofia's idea developed quietly across the week, between library benches and night buses. She had scribbled a core argument into her notebook, the same notebook with the scholarship stamp. Dates stamped along the margins of the pages where she worked out logic like someone sewing a hem. The group meeting was brief. Thago took the lead because he always took the lead. He had the voice the room listened to and the knack for theatrics. He liked to stand. He liked to be the one people remembered. Sofia's contribution had been the axis of the whole thing. In the meeting, she said what needed to be said and sketched the timeline on the margin of a printout. Patricia, who sat 2 seats down and preferred to keep her hands in her lap, nodded silently and later told Sofia the gesture of the timeline would hold in the presentation. Patricia did not speak in the meeting much. She watched with a kind of careful attention that felt like alliance. When the group presented in class, Thago stood before the room and said the words as if they had always been his. The professor nodded politely, a motion that was all the approval Thago wanted. Later, in the cafeteria, someone laughed and asked where the brain of the group was, the scholarship kid. Thago answered with a small, sharp grin that distributed credit the way a generous man distributes crumbs. Credit. It was a word Sofia had become expert at collecting without spectacle. She was more interested in truth than in applause. But the classroom was a marketplace for recognition, and the currency was visible. At home, at night, Sofia copied the group notes into her notebook and dated every page. Her handwriting was small and precise, the kind that kept things from getting lost. She wrote reflections at the top of margins like breadcrumb markers. Concept, week 3. Data sketch, Septi 12, library, 11:22 p.m. On some pages, she drew little code-like diagrams, made notes about who she had checked facts with, which library database she had used. The notebook smelled faintly of old coffee and pencil. It would become the ledger of her authorship, the thing she would keep if she had to prove she had been the one thinking. The morning after the presentation, Flavio called a meeting that was read as routine. The department coordinator would attend. The group would answer a few clarifying questions. It was to be procedural, nothing more. For students, procedural often meant fragile as glass. Sofia went to the meeting with her notebook tucked under her arm. Jeanette, a professor who taught lit theory and had the softest blazer in the building, slipped into the room and gave Sofia a quick nod. Jeanette had always been the kind of teacher who noticed footnotes. She noticed small things that mattered, a citation pattern, the cadence of someone's speech, the way a hand smoothed a page. That morning she gave Sofia 2 folded words that felt like armor. I saw. Later, in the hallway, Jeanette would offer more, her quiet willingness to be a witness. The meeting itself trailed like a slow, legal animal. Flavio asked a few questions that were technical but required tone more than content. He glanced at Thago with the kind of look that asked for confirmation. Thago answered crisply. Patricia answered too, and her voice wavered only a little when she confirmed the timeline. Somewhere between polite and sharp, someone's email pinged. Someone had forwarded a note. The word authorship appeared and then slid into conversation like a pebble in a pond. It would have been possible in a fairer room to let the facts unfurl without damage. But fairness requires attention and an institution capable of listening beyond its preferred narrative. This one had blind spots. 2 days later, when the selection list for the campus presentation cycle was posted on the notice board, Sofia's name was there. Small, printed, another notch in her long list of small victories. She felt steady and oddly light. This showcase was an opening. It offered 6 minutes under a small, bright light and the chance to demonstrate what was hers without interruption. She planned to show an experiment she had outlined, the one with timelines and a set of questions she had dreamed into the margins of her notebook. She did not imagine how many people would prefer she did not. On a damp afternoon, a single email landed in her inbox with the dry neutrality of bureaucratic language. The subject line read, "Notice of suspension from extracurricular activities, pending inquiry." The body of the message was politer than any accusation should be, but it was precise. An anonymous complaint had been filed alleging improper authorship in the project submitted to the presentation cycle. Until the inquiry concluded, her participation in the extracurricular program would be suspended. Her breath stuttered for a moment like a trapped bird. She sat at the kitchen table with the email open on her phone and watched the screen as if it might rearrange itself into something kinder. Her mother, who had been setting out the mop and bucket, looked up when Sofia did not move. Vera wiped her hands on a towel and crossed the short distance between kitchen and chair. She sat without asking questions, without the kind of loud counsel people expect. She only put her hand on Sofia's knuckles, which felt like a parent's rock. "We will call Jeanette," Vera said. The sound of the words was practical, like the closing of a drawer. "We will gather the notebook. We will not let them call you guilty before they listen." Sofia wanted to say that she could handle it, that she would go to the coordinator herself, that she had bookmarked every page with the necessary dates. But she knew the way institutions sometimes preferred to move. Slowly, with a bias for those who looked like part of their expectation. She had long since learned the economy of quiet fortitude. Resignation was a luxury she could not afford. She drew the notebook toward her, opened it, ran her finger along the penciled dates, as if the grooves contained more truth when she touched them. When she called Jeanette, the older professor's voice arrived like a tether across a sudden dark. "Meet me in my office in 20, Jeanette said. "Bring the notebook. We'll make a list of witnesses." In Jeanette's office, the light came through blinds like piano keys. Shelves sagged with books, margin notes sticking out like flags. Jeanette had a habit of pressing the corner of a page with her thumb when she was thinking. She asked calmly, almost with academic curiosity, what Sofia had done on which dates. She asked about drafts. She asked about the databases used. She wrote things down with a pen that made a steady line. Then she did something small that mattered. She put down the pen and said she had seen Sofia work across the semester, in the library lobby, during office hours, in the margin of seminars, and that she would testify to it. Sofia left Jeanette's office with a list of names. Patricia, who had come to Jeanette alone and described the timeline. Diego, who had been in the study group and remembered talking data at 2 a.m., and a campus security assistant who remembered Thargo leaving the lab late on a night when the timeline had been updated. Jeanette told her to make photocopies of every dated page. She told her to print the email thread she had with the research database. She told her to keep the original notebook with her at all times. Sofia went to work. She washed dishes in the student cafeteria in the slow hours between lunch and evening classes, not to earn money, though it helped, but because the job's rhythm soothed her and because there was dignity in honest labor. The kitchen smelled of fried onions and possibility. She stacked trays with the same methodical care she used in note-taking. Later, when her shift was over, she sat under the strobe lights of the campus walkway and made copies, each sheet a small blade of defense against a narrative that might prefer to call her a thief. Rumors spread like a pattern across the fabric of campus. Some people spoke quietly, somewhere between guilt and curiosity. Others, emboldened by the initial email and the picture it painted, treated her as if she had already been judged. The whispers were small hands, picking at seams. They reached into the cafeteria, into the library, into the spaces where people carried pride and little else. At the edges of all this, Thago moved with a different conduct. A friend of donors, he understood how to choose his allies. He had been cultivated by privilege into using charm as armor. He texted the group with an offer to clarify their presentation. And when she declined his early overtures to rework the slides together, he passed her a smile that promised nothing but the spectacle of it. Sofia's life contracted to essentials: compile, witness, remember the dates. She made lists and crossed things off. She wrote a page entitled "Reasons to Quit" and then underlined it so hard the pen cut the paper. She filled the page with small, legitimate reasons: fatigue, public shame, better offers elsewhere, and then, at the bottom, another sentence. Because you promised. Because you promised. She then crossed that too. In the late weeks that followed, she rehearsed in empty classrooms. The late light through the windows turned chalk dust into stars. She would set the laptop on the teacher's desk and talk to a room of chairs, saying the lines of her argument in the same cadence she planned to use when she had permission to speak before visiting researchers. Jeanette came twice and suggested sharpening the opening, making the methodology visible in a way non-specialists could follow. Jeanette suggested narrative hooks that did not compromise rigor. She suggested simplicity. She also said quietly, "You must be prepared to show process, not just results." She meant page numbers, logs, marginalia. Process was living evidence of authorship. Sofia drilled the opening. She wrote the beginning so that anyone hearing her would be able to map the steps she had taken. She rehearsed the tone she would use: clear, patient, unembarrassed. She practiced a brief anecdote about her mother cleaning the atrium while donors ate lunch above them, how that scene had taught her to look for truths in the margins. The anecdote was not an appeal. It was a frame. As the inquiry date approached, the department circulated a schedule. Face-to-face hearings were to be held in the coordinator's small office. Administrative protocol demanded witnesses be called, statements recorded, and evidence kept on file. The university prided itself publicly on fairness. Privately, it moved in ways that often preserved itself. The difference between the two had to be navigated with more than courage. It required proof and witnesses who would not flinch. On the morning she planned to deliver her packet of documents to the coordinator's assistant, she found an envelope on the kitchen table with no return address. It contained a single line on thin index paper. "Keep your head down. They'll eat you if you're loud." The handwriting was rushed, the ink smudged. Vera looked at the paper and did not say the thing most people expected. She touched Sofia's cheek with knuckles that had scrubbed floors for decades, and then she folded the little scrap and set it in the notebook between 2 pages, dated a month earlier. "We will not be eaten," she said. "We will be heard." When Sofia walked across the courtyard toward the coordinator's office, the campus looked like a stage full of pale costumes. Students rushed to seminars, donors read newspapers on benches, security guards watched traffic like prop managers. Someone left a glass of coffee abandoned on a ledge, a small, reckless portrait of ordinary life. Sofia tightened the strap of her backpack and kept her gaze forward. At the coordinator's door, she met Diego in the hallway, hands in pockets, embarrassed and steady. He handed her a small envelope with a note inside. "I'll be there." Patricia arrived beside him, eyes determined in a way that made Sofia's throat close with gratitude. Small alliances had the geometry of oxygen. The coordinator, a woman named Lucia who wore her hair short and made efficient notes, received the packet with professional gentleness. She explained the process. Statements would be taken under record, witnesses contacted, the anonymous complaint would be reviewed, and a timeline of events constructed. She said plainly that the university could not allow extracurricular participation to continue while an allegation of authorship impropriety remained open. It read to Sofia like common sense. It also read like a long night. "Bring all your originals and copies," Lucia said. "We will compare dates. We will call witnesses. You will have the opportunity to be heard." Sofia opened her bag and laid the notebook on the table. The pages looked luminous under the fluorescent light, margins crowded with notes, timestamps, little diagrams like constellations. She felt something inside her shift, a buoyancy that arrived as if she had been hoisted by a rope, This was what she had worked for: evidence, process, the slow mechanisms of fairness. She understood that the institution could be corrected, but only if it listened. Outside the door, in the atrium, men and women passed with the small politics of campus life. One of the security guards pointed toward a sleek car and laughed with a man in a suit. Flavio strolled by in his slow, deliberate manner, a cup of coffee balanced in his hand, like a prop of authority. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. There was no apology in the glance, but there was a weight, an awareness that the machinery of consequence was beginning to turn. Sofia closed the notebook and slid it into her bag. She felt the fabric of the strap against the place where it had rubbed, and thought of the years that left traces only if you looked closely. This was what she had: scars and marks and a ledger of the days she had claimed for herself. She did not imagine an easy outcome. Justice rarely wore a single face. It came across forms stamped and signed, through the small voices of modest witnesses, the precise dates on pages, the corroboration of people too ordinary to make spectacle. But she believed in the arithmetic of truth. She had always believed that numbers would be fair when people were not. Later that afternoon, as the building bathed in low, warm light, an anonymous sheet of paper found its way into a bin near the cafeteria with folded corners. Rumor had a way of moving faster than process. Thago refreshed his phone constantly. Flavio returned to the lecture hall and scrolled through notes. Sofia sat on a bench and waited. She felt the notebook in her bag like a steady heart. She remembered for a moment the morning when her mother had taped the scholarship letter to the refrigerator with a magnet and declared, under the breath only she and Sofia shared, "We will not be invisible." She pressed her thumb to that memory and held it as someone might hold a small flame in a wind. If she had a fear, it was not of failing. Failure in some shapes was familiar and manageable. Her fear came from the possibility that the institution would choose a narrative that made her silence more convenient. She had seen this pattern in soft sentences. It was a misread. We expected different methods. There was a misunderstanding. Those phrases were the polite versions of erasure. She would not let them erase. A voicemail from Jeanette glowed on her phone. "Be ready. Edson is coming next week with his team. They're scouts, and they want to meet students who can think. Keep to the dates and the drafts. Bring evidence." Jeanette's voice had that calm edge. She did not promise miracles. She said only facts and small confidences. Edson was a researcher who led a rumored development program and, if he listened without bias, would understand process. This was not a promise of rescue. It was a chance. Sofia folded her fingers into the strap of her bag and breathed. She practiced the opening line she would use for the presentation in the small corner of her mind that held speech. When we consider the margin, we consider what the main text overlooks. She had no intention of using rhetoric that would weaponize her life. She wanted clarity. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list of the witnesses' statements she expected to gather. Patricia would provide an account of the timeline. Diego would speak to the night in the lab. Jeanette would confirm she had seen the outlines in drafts. Vera would not be called as a formal witness. She would be the quiet force who held the home steady, whose shifts of cleaning the atrium had folded days into a rhythm that had taught Sofia to keep watch. On a thin, sleepless page, Sofia wrote an affirmation to herself in a blocky script. It read, "You will not surrender your work to shame." Under it, she wrote the date and folded the page into the notebook like a talisman. The next morning, the campus seemed to hold its breath. There were more people in the hallways. A visiting researcher's name had appeared among the notices for the coming week. Edson's name was there in letters that promised something like attention, a rare currency on a campus where small lives often moved unnoticed. Sofia met Jeanette at the stairwell. They walked together to the seminar room where she had practiced. Jeanette's hand brushed the railing and she said, fighting the sort of impatience that was also care, I will be in the hearing, will be methodical. Bring the originals. Do not, under any circumstance, sign anything without counsel. She smiled very briefly, the way someone smiles before a small battle. Sofia nodded. She wanted to tell Jeanette about the envelope at the kitchen table and how it had said, "Keep your head down." She wanted to tell her mother's voice and the way Vera had set the scrap in the notebook like a quiet confession. But instead she said, "I will be precise," and the words felt like the only vow she could trust. The morning of the inquiry, the coordinator's small office felt like a chamber of scales. Lucia opened an evidence folder and asked Sofia to read each date aloud. Patricia's testimony was clear and concise. Diego's voice cracked a little, but got through the night of research. Jeanette described office hours, piecemeal drafts pulled from the shelves of the campus library. The security assistant confirmed who had been present in the lab at particular times. Each voice bolstered a line in the narrative that made Sofia's authorship visible. Flavio sat across the table from them and folded his hands. He had a look of cautious docketing, as if he had been taking notes for years, and now found himself at the business of his own surprise. He asked questions that had the structure of argument built in, but lacked the warmth of curiosity. His voice, when he spoke, was a softer version of the dismissal he had offered in the classroom. When the inquiry session recessed for the day, no one promised an immediate verdict. Lucia explained the review would take time. Procedures required deliberation. The language of due process hummed like a machine being assembled. Sofia left with her notebook and a stack of photocopies, the pages like armor. The suspension from extracurriculars remained in effect. The official email a small ghost that followed her like an echo. She went home and found Vera humming while polishing a stair rail in a rhythm that was practically a prayer. Vera looked up when Sofia set the notebook down and, without comment, wiped her hands on her apron and sat opposite her daughter. They did not need to say the things that were obvious. They had already made the promises the world required. Sofia took a moment to breathe, to let her mouth form the words she would use when she presented, if she were allowed. Process matters. It is the way we prove that thinking was independent. She imagined the visiting researchers, Edson and his team, sitting in the front row and looking not at her shoes, but at the timeline and the page stamps. Outside, the campus evening light leaned long across the quad. Flavio packed his bag slowly at the office desk, pausing once to look at the photo in his wallet, as if to remember a version of himself that had not yet accrued the armor of habit. There are reasons people become certain, a private aside would say: reputation, fear, the need to preserve a narrative in which they are the right judge. That did not make them incapable of being wrong. Sofia lay the notebook on her bed, and unusually opened the back to the first pages where, in slightly trembling ink, she had once written notes at age 12, things she wanted to prove to herself. She read for a time, letting the sentences remind her of the core: curiosity, stubbornness, fidelity to evidence. She closed the notebook then, felt the groove of the strap, and slept with that small reliance like a steady pulse. Morning arrived like an instruction. There were emails to answer, people who had offered statements to coordinate, and a short message from Jeanette confirming she had arranged for Patricia and Diego to meet the coordinator during the final review. There was also a brief note from a campus administrator. The university remains committed to due process. Please be patient while investigations are completed. Sofia rehearsed once again. She practiced the anecdote about her mother and the atrium. She made sure not to weaponize their life, but to articulate the roots of her interest. She finished each run-through with a note to herself to breathe at the end. Calm, clear, not theatrical. As the week moved forward, quiet things conspired. A visiting researcher's assistant made a note in his planner to attend the final review. A donors' foundation scheduled a public seminar in the same building where the showcase would take place. An assistant posted the list of presenters in the atrium where the cleaning staff passed twice a day, so that Vera might see her daughter's name on the board if she happened to be sweeping at that hour. Small gestures had a way of making grand things possible. 2 days before the visiting researchers arrived, an envelope appeared on Jeanette's desk. Inside was a short, hand-printed note. "We notice what you do." It was unsigned, but carried the tone of someone used to anonymity. Jeanette read it and folded it into her files. She told herself not to let it become a story. She also, privately, felt the small shiver of recognition. Someone was watching. Sofia watched too. She was careful about what she let the watching do to her. She kept to facts, she kept to the notebook, she kept to the work. There was a thin hope that the process might go in her favor because of content, not because someone would wave a hand and produce a miracle. She trusted the arithmetic of dates and drafts more than rumor. She had always done so. She believed enough in the slow fairness of procedure to stand by it. On the morning the researchers were due, the department buzzed with a small electricity. Jeanette sent a quick text, "Be yourself. Trust the pages." Sofia set the notebook in her bag for the 100th time and walked out into the morning with the worn strap across her shoulder like an insignia. She passed her mother wiping a bench and did not slow. People stopped to stare at the donors' cars as they arrived. The courtyard thrummed with voices and the clink of cups. Edson's team moved through like people on a mission. They asked questions of the faculty and scribbled notes. Sofia stood at the edge of the seminar room with Jeanette and watched the visitors file in. She felt the familiar calm before a storm. She wanted, in a small, private way, for the researchers to see not the marquee of a story, scholarship student versus entitled world, but the evidence of someone who had thought carefully, argued carefully, and had been diligent enough to leave traces. When the door opened for the session and people took their seats, Sofia felt the swelling of something like possibility. She had prepared for this moment in silence and with stubborn work. She had gathered witnesses, she had recorded dates, she had kept a record. Her phone buzzed with a message she did not want at that minute, an anonymous tip, retyped and forwarded. Someone claimed the group presentation had been borrowed. Sofia read it as if it were wind. She folded it away and tapped Jeanette's shoulder. Jeanette's eyes met hers and offered a look that translated to, "Keep steady." Sofia took a breath and prepared herself to speak to an audience that may not yet be ready to hear more than prejudice. She had no illusions about the battle ahead. She knew that the administrative gears might grind slowly and that vindication might come in the form of a letter, stamped and signed, dry, exact, and without fanfare. She also knew that there was something more personal at stake, the dignity of work and the right to claim one's thoughts. She thought of Vera folding the uniform each night, of the way the cleaning cart shone when she pushed it, of the grocery lists with their careful math. She thought, too, of the moment her scholarship letter had been clamped to the fridge. She would not erase those things for anyone. The seminar began. The researchers asked questions. Edson's voice was direct but fair. He favored evidence. Laptops glowed in the dim light. The professor introduced speakers. A student took the stage. Sofia sat and listened, feeling the rhythm of the room outside as if it were a tide. A knock at the back door interrupted the talk. A campus assistant entered with a formal envelope and placed it on the coordinator's table. Lucia opened it and read it quickly. Her face did not change, which is often the first sign that the content is significant. She folded the paper, set it in front of her and said, "This will be handled in due process." Sofia's stomach tightened. The envelope might have contained anything, an update, a new witness, a piece of information that could tip a balance. It could also have contained the last bureaucratic nail she feared. She felt the room tilt slightly as people shifted, taking in the new fact that something official lay in the coordinator's hands. At that moment, As the researchers' attention oscillated between their notes and the people in the room, Sofia realized how thin the margin was between being seen as credible and being dismissed as an interesting footnote. The margin had always been thin for people like her, thin as the strap of a backpack that had been worn to a pale thread. She reached into her bag and felt the notebook, the spine, the weight of the pages. She remembered the promise she had scrawled and folded like a talisman. She pressed her thumb into the paper and felt its texture, proof, beneath her skin. Outside, the campus continued in its indifferent grace. A group of donors laughed on a bench. Vera pushed her cleaning cart past the atrium doors, the lemon smell trailing in her wake. She passed the name board where Sofia's name had once been printed and glanced quietly with a parent's steady pride. In the seminar room, a hush fell as the coordinator rose and said softly that the university required a pause in extracurricular activities while the inquiry proceeded. The visiting researchers listened and considered the calendar. Edson's gaze wandered to the front row, where students sat with notebooks and straps worn from years of use. He looked at Sofia, then at her notebook, and paused, as if he had seen something worth more than curiosity. Sofia felt the room tilt and then hold. A small tension stretched between the people and the institutional language that had the power to suspend more than activity. It could suspend a sense of belonging. She put her hand over the notebook and felt for a second both very exposed and very protected. She had done what she could, documented, gathered witnesses, practiced. The rest would be carried out in formal processes she could not control. Jeanette squeezed her shoulder. Patricia sat beside her and offered a small, solid smile. Diego shifted in his seat like a man making himself present. When the session adjourned, Sofia opened her bag and stepped out into the corridor that smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. The campus sun struck the glass and made a small jewel of each raindrop that clung to the pavement from a late morning shower. Sofia walked slowly, the notebook like an anchor at her hip. She did not know what the next hours would bring. She only knew the next step: prepare, collect, witness. On a quiet bench near the atrium that evening, she wrote a single line across a blank page. Truth is not a shout. It is a ledger of small acts. She closed the notebook and folded the page into the section with the earliest dates, where the scholarship stamp still glinted in the light like a promise. Someone passed with a plastic cup. Vera appeared in the doorway and motioned toward her. They would go home together. The world would carry on its murmurs, its assumptions. But there was a rigid, undeniable thing that the rumor could not touch. The marks on paper, the timestamps, the living witnesses who would speak to the hours Sofia had spent thinking. She stood up and slung the worn strap over her shoulder. The cleaning cart in the nearby corridor gleamed in evening light, as if it were an emblem. Vera locked eyes with her and said very simply, "We will be there." If that was not a guarantee of victory, it was a guarantee of presence, and sometimes, in exacting institutional rooms, presence mattered most. A new message came across Sofia's phone. It was from an unknown. A new message came across Sofia's phone. It was from an unknown number, the kind that could be anything: a delivery, a spam offer, a misdirected text. She tapped it with a thumb that trembled for only a second. "We saw your dossier. Would like to speak with you. Edson's assistant, meet Thursday 10 a.m., office 312. Relief arrived like a cool wind. It was not vindication, it was interest. It was a chance to be heard by someone whose work required attention to detail. Sofia closed the message and walked slower, as if prolonging the moment would help it settle into her chest. She imagined questions that might be asked, and the pages she would slide across a table, the photocopies, the spreadsheet printouts with timestamps, the dog-eared margins of her earliest drafts. Those pages had a kind of gravity now. They had weight more than sentiment. The next 3 days moved with a nervous efficiency. Jeanette and Patricia rehearsed possible lines and practiced the sequence of testimonies. Diego, who had always carried his politeness like a small shield, wrote a clear, brief statement and left it at Lucia's desk with a note that read, "I will testify in person." Lucia acknowledged receipt with a calm reply that smelled of procedure and duty. The anonymous envelope with the hurried handwriting sat in the notebook like a stubborn insect. Vera, seeing it, folded it back into the pages with a mother's silent ritual. Flavio's manner altered in ways that everyone could notice without time-stamping. He was the same, only pricklier. He lectured with an edge, as if the air needed to be kept cool by sharper words. He scheduled office hours and kept them empty. He stopped lingering afterwards to chat with junior staff. Once, passing by a seminar room, he left his coffee half-drunk and walked away as if he were the one carrying an injury. Rumor, fruitless in its haste, suggested he had received complaints from his own circle. He was human, with the peculiar vanity that comes from being used to shaping opinion, and people around him observed his unease like a weather pattern. Diego retreated into a quieter kind of performance. He smiled with exactly the same teeth, but less frequently. He posted photos at a coffee shop with captions that sounded on the surface the same as before, but the comments below were thinner. The students who had once laughed with him now offered shorter replies. There was no public confrontation. That was the point. The pressure of consequence often works in invisible ways. People notice that a man loses small courtesies. He notices the absence of an invitation to the right table. Sofia kept to the small rituals that preserved her focus. She scrubbed pans, stacked trays, and memorized the rhythm of the dishwasher like a litany. The physical labor was not a concession. It was a place she could go to be useful and present, and not under the bureaucratic eye. At night, she returned to the notebook and added a clean line to the margin. Witnesses confirmed. Patricia, 9:15. Diego, 9:16. Security, 9:17. She placed the photocopy of the database printout between pages, with an index card labeled, "Evidence Process." On Thursday, she dressed like someone who wanted to be taken seriously. A simple blouse, jeans pressed at the seams, hair pulled back where it could not be mistaken for carelessness. She took a bus that ran a less direct route, but allowed her to rehearse the opening line in the cramped warmth of passengers. She said it aloud 3 times, and then stopped so as not to draw attention. When we consider what the margins record, we find the outlines of the main argument. And it sounded academic in a way she had practiced to be. Office 312 smelled of coffee and paper. Edson's assistant greeted her with a precise smile and led her down a long hall lined with framed photographs of people with tidy smiles. The assistant gestured toward a glass door. Behind it, Edson stood up from a table heaped with papers. He was not the cartoon of the successful researcher. No extravagant watch, no theatrical manners. He moved as someone who had learned to listen to silence and who could distinguish the tone of a sentence before it was finished. "Miss Silva," he said, and he pronounced her last name as if it were a line of evidence, straight, measured. Sofia answered with a steady nod. She had carried the notebook in her bag as if it were a companion. Now she set it on the table, open to a page with a clean header, timeline, dated notes, library sessions. Edson leaned forward, reading without surprise the small, careful architecture of her work. He asked questions that required more than rehearsed answers. He wanted to know how she had chosen methods, why she had favored one database over another, where an outlier figure had come from, and how she had checked it. His tone was direct, but absent of condescension. When she spoke, she did not rush. She explained the logic in the order she had assembled it, and when she referred to particular nights in the lab, she could feel the memory of that lamp and the smell of cold coffee as if it were a tangible proof. Halfway through, without pomp, he closed the notebook and said, "I'd like to see the full draft." His voice was casual, as if this was a common step. For Sofia, it sounded like a bell. Edson did not sign an offer in that room. He made a different kind of gesture. He asked to watch her present whenever the inquiry allowed, and he asked Lucia if she could be informed when the process concluded. After a brisk conversation, he asked if she would consider a development workshop his team ran for promising students. It was not a guarantee of anything beyond mentorship, but it included access to journal databases and a small stipend to cover research expenses. He spoke of standards and method and of a hunger in his team for students who could show process. "We invest in people who show their thinking," he said. "We look for the ledger." That afternoon, though she had not yet been cleared, Sofia sat on a bench and let the possibility settle. She felt grateful, but not grateful in the sense of charity. It was gratitude for being assessed on evidence, on craft, on the ledger she had kept. That kind of recognition required no red carpet. The inquiry moved forward with a procedural solemnity. Lucia requested copies from campus security and from the library's reservations log. She compiled statements into an organized folder and typed minutes that had a clipped, impartial cadence. Flavio provided a written account, which read as measured as if he had dictated it into a recorder of precedent. His tone leaned on doubts and questions about process more than flat accusation. Lucia read everything, with a formality that suggested the institution wanted its name to be clean at the end of an honest exam. At one point, before the final deliberation, Jeanette asked Lucia if someone from the research office might attend as an observer. Lucia consulted her calendar and allowed it. Edson's assistant supplied a brief note confirming the research team's interest in evaluating student process. The presence of external observers did not turn the hearing into a spectacle. It added a layer of attentive scrutiny that favored evidence over rumor. During the final review meeting, the room felt like a machine assembled to sort truth from supposition. It had paper for every part, and voices arranged like instruments. Patricia spoke first, and simply. She described the timeline, the meeting where the timeline appeared, the margin with the handwriting that matched Sofia's. Diego, against a background of a voice that wavered, described an all-nighter where Sofia had explained a pivot in the dataset, and where Thargo had listened but not noted the methodological choice. The security assistant read a short log, noting who had been in the lab and when. Jeanette produced notes from office hours, dates, topics, incremental drafts. When Lucia asked Sofia to speak, she did not ask for apology or anger. She asked for clarity. Sofia talked about process, about how she had arrived at a solution, and how small things, an offhand correction in a library transcription, a misread column, could change an interpretation. She slid the notebook across the table. Each page had a line of context, the library database used, the timestamp, the margin note about who had been consulted. It was not dramatic, it was orderly. At the end of the hearing, Lucia sat back and read from her notes. The language was technical, corroboration of authorship, evidence supports claim, no procedural inconsistencies detected in the recorded timeline. There were matters to be clarified in department practice. The need for clearer guidelines on group authorship, on how oral discussions translate to documented claim. But when Lucia closed the file, she announced that there was insufficient evidence to support the anonymous allegation of improper authorship. The suspension was lifted. The pause that followed felt like a held breath released in a gust. It was not fireworks. It was a return to the ordinary machinery of fair process. Patricia wept quietly into a tissue. Diego exhaled a laugh that sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for too long. Jeanette smiled with the small relief of someone who trusted procedure and had it, this time, move in her favor. Lucia said she would issue a brief departmental memo addressing expectations around authorship and reminding faculty of the need for equitable etiquette in student recognition. Flavio received, a week later, a formal note from the department chair. The note was professional, referencing concerns about the tone of classroom commentary and the importance of equitable treatment. It required participation in a workshop on academic mentorship and a meeting with the dean to discuss departmental culture. There was no theatrical humiliation in the reprimand, only administrative consequence. Flavio read the note under the hum of the office lights and folded it into his briefcase like something he would remember. The university's letter that cleared Sofia arrived as an email with a neutral subject line and a body that contained the language of process, conclusion of inquiry, lack of substantive evidence for improper authorship, acknowledgement of rigorous documentation. She printed it and taped it to the inside cover of her notebook like another kind of date. The recognition was not a coronation. It was the unadorned acknowledgement that the ledger matched the work. When Edson heard the outcome, he sent a short message that was almost spare. "When you are ready, we would like to invite you to the workshop." Sofia replied with thanks and a tentative yes. The offer came without strings attached. The team wanted engagement, not patronage. The day she was allowed again to participate in the presentation cycle, the room felt less like a field of threat and more like a place that could receive ideas. She presented in the small, bright window allotted, 6 minutes under a light, and her voice carried an economy of tone she had cultivated, direct, unadorned, precise. She started with a short anecdote about margins, the cleaning cart in the atrium, the friction between the polished surfaces above and the quiet work below, and then mapped the steps she had taken. She showed process, not spectacle. The audience watched numbers and dates and marginalia move across the screen. Edson took notes. The researchers leaned forward. When she finished, the applause was polite and not excessive. It was the kind of sound that matched the content. After the session, a lot of small convergences happened at once. Edson approached her and spoke about developing the piece further. "There's rigor here," he said. "I'd like to support you in refining the methodology for publication and maybe a conference submission." He mentioned the workshop would include a stipend to cover research materials. It was an offer shaped to amplify competence, not to buy silence. Jeanette, waiting nearby, embraced her like a colleague rather than a pupil. Patricia came up and simply said, "I'm proud of you." It was a small sentence that carried the bulk of friends. Outside the seminar room, with the corridor sun splashing the floor in squares, a woman in a restrained suit waited near the doorway. She watched the wrap-up of the session with a calm that suggested she had time to measure things. She wore a thin lapel pin that identified her as belonging to a foundation, an emblem that some students recognized and some did not. She introduced herself to Jeanette as Mara from the Lacerda Foundation, and she asked to speak with Sofia for a moment. Sofia, who had learned to arrange her instincts around choice, followed Mara to a small alcove. Mara did not speak in the celebratory way Edson had. She spoke in a tone that suggested a long memory. "I've seen your name before," she said, not in the way of gossip, but with the steady clarity of records. "My foundation keeps an eye on young researchers. We are careful. We do not do shows. We do what we can quietly." Sofia listened, crisp with the caution that had become a habit. She thought perhaps the foundation wanted to offer funding, or a scholarship extension, or a note of congratulations. Money, in this instant, would be practical: materials, travel, maybe a small stipend. She had learned how to accept help without allowing it to define her. Mara paused, and then added in a voice that softened, "I also know someone who asked us to look after quiet things. He asked us to look after a certain girl if she ever showed what he hoped she would. He insisted we never say his name, but he asked that his support be discreet because he wanted her to be able to grow without the weight of expectation." Sofia felt the air shift like a small gust underrating an entire summer. "Who?" she asked, but she did not demand the answer. Mara folded her hands and said, "You may have heard of the Moretti Foundation. Mr. Moretti is a donor to the university and to several educational initiatives. He tends to be private. He also sometimes funds opportunities for students he has supported personally. He asked us to pay attention to any student who showed method and humility. He asked that we avoid spotlight. He asked that help be offered as a normal resource, not a favor. Sofia's heart made a noise she felt in her throat. She had never imagined a name. She had imagined hands and voices, but not that particular frame. Moretti, a surname that appeared sometimes with large donations in the city, was one she had seen on a donor plaque in the atrium, but never thought to connect to her life. The sentence felt slippery between the sense of recognition and the truth of how she had been raised. Mara chuckled very softly, picking her words. "There's a story here I'll only tell once. Years ago, when your mother applied for a community support meeting at the foundation, Mr. Moretti took interest. He learned about your grades and your quiet determination and asked a private favor of us, to make certain doors stay open quietly if they could. He did not want public credit. He is insistent that merit be merit. He asked that any help not become a headline. That's why you may not have a plaque under your name. That was his choice." Sofia's throat tightened around a question she did not yet know. "You mean—" Mara's eyes were gentle. "He adopted her, Sofia. Or rather," she corrected herself with a professional steadiness, "he is your adoptive father. He and his family decided to keep the arrangement private, to allow you to live your life without the noise that sometimes follows notoriety. They believed you should be judged by your work. For a second the world pressed in, and then pulled away. The news did not feel like a key thrown into a lock that would open instant doors. It felt like a piece of one of her own mornings had been revealed, a patch of wallpaper she had known but not labeled. Sofia thought of Vera ironing the uniform and of the morning the scholarship letter had been taped to the fridge. She thought of a life made modest by deliberate choice. The revelation, strange as it was, settled like an extra layer of context, not an explanation for everything. "You don't understand," Mara continued, careful. "Mr. Moretti asked us to stay away from spectacle. He doesn't want to buy outcomes. He wants to remove obstacles when possible, fund a workshop, pay for research access. He asked that if we ever reached out, we did it quietly. We did not want to affect your standing or let anyone say justice arrived because of money." Sofia inhaled and let the air leave slowly. "I don't want to be seen as someone who used money to get here," she said. "Everything I did was mine." Mara's hands rested on the table between them. "So do not. We will offer access, resources, mentorship. Nothing that will change the fact that you earned your work." Sofia nodded. The words were small, aligned with her values. They offered resources but not a crown. She felt something akin to relief, and the peculiar oddness of learning how others had tried to protect her because of a choice she had not made nor asked for. The Moretti name meant larger things on paper. In her life, it would be a discreet set of keys placed gently on a table so she could open a door if she chose. When she left the seminar room that day, Vera was waiting near the atrium, with her cart gleaming in the late light. Sofia found herself wanting to tell her mother everything at once. The clearing, Edson's offer, Mara's admission, and yet the words could not be delivered as a hurried pile. She walked up to Vera and wrapped her arms around her waist, and Vera's skin smelled of lemon disinfectant and clean cloth. "You will not believe what happened," Sofia began. And then she did the sensible thing. She walked with her mother along the corridor, telling the story in small pieces, leaving room between sentences for Vera's quiet comments. Vera listened with a concentration tempered by a life of practice. When Sofia mentioned the adoption and the Moretti name, Vera's expression changed not into amazement, but into the particular sort of soft satisfaction that ripples across someone who knows the cost of privacy. "She always told me to keep you close and protect you," Vera said. She touched Sofia's cheek as if to confirm that the child and the adult were still the same person. If someone helps, we accept. But we do it like we clean, quietly, properly. We line things up so the work can be done. They walked home with no fanfare. No one came to press a rose into their hands. There was no camera. There was a smallness to the day's events that made them feel honest. The Moretti name did not echo across the city in a way that altered the fabric around them. It was a detail that reframed assumptions. If anything, it made the petty cruelties of the lecture hall look even more transparent. Why would someone who was quietly supported have to prove herself so hard? The irony felt bitter, but it did not define the victory. Institutionally, the university's final memo that followed the inquiry recommended steps to prevent similar episodes. Clearer guidelines on acknowledging contributions in group work, a recommendation that faculty attend training on unconscious bias, an encouragement that staff assist students in documenting process when a project moves from private discussion to public presentation. These were bureaucratic words, yes, yet they were also machinery that, if used, could make small future injustices less likely. Flavio accepted the department's mandated steps with the same mild dignity he wore to lectures. He attended the workshop on mentorship, listened to panels about student curricula, and was assigned to co-supervise a class that focused on documentation and ethics. No one expected a theatrical confession. Some people change in small ways. A softer tone when calling on scholarship students. A more explicit attribution of concepts during group presentations. That, Jeanette said, was the point. Change that looks like moderation is often what sustains fairness. Thago's trajectory did not include a public ceremony of contrition. He found himself with fewer invitations to speak at certain panels. He retained his network, but the edges frayed. In a quiet corridor conversation with a junior faculty member, he said, "Maybe I was careless." It was a sentence that contained regret without deep excavation. People around him moved on. That, too, was part of the economy of consequence, minor social corrections that erode thoughtless privilege. The weeks after the inquiry were a slow settling. Edson invited Sofia to the workshop. It was everything he had promised: focused method sessions, access to datasets, gentle critique that did not posture. Sofia found in those weeks a new vocabulary for her curiosity. She learned how to present a problem so that the method itself was legible to non-specialists. She learned to write an abstract that did not assume prior belief. She learned to ask for funds to cover a modest set of research materials without feeling as if she were taking alms. The stipend she received paid for a small, practical thing. It allowed her to rent software that scraped larger datasets, to print high-quality graphs, and to cover travel to a conference in a city 2 hours away. There, she presented a refined draft of her project. It was a professional audience, and not particularly interested in the romance of her biography, but they were interested in the clarity of her method. She received a standard reviewer's note about tightening the model parameters and an offer from a graduate student in another program to collaborate on a follow-up study. It was the kind of mundane success that had more power than a single headline. Back home, Vera began to move with a lighter step. She still woke before dawn, still pushed the cart and polished rails with the same methodical patience, but she smiled more often when she returned from work. The board in the atrium still had donor names on brass plaques, but Vera carried with her the quiet proof inside her pocket: Sofia's printed copy of the university letter, the photocopies of dates that made them both feel less like intruders and more like companions in a life that refused erasure. Months passed and created a new texture in the university. Jeanette helped spin a small seminar into a recurring series about process and documentation. Patricia began working as a research assistant in Edson's lab, where she learned the value of meticulous record-keeping and found her own voice in an environment that appreciated the small logistics of method. Diego remained a constant, steady, present, prone to lending a pen or a shoulder when needed. The learning curve extended beyond Sofia. The department, in quiet ways, adjusted its assumptions. Sofia herself continued to keep her notebook, now thicker, the spine softened with use, because it had become more than evidence. It was also a map of a practice. She filled the margins with notes to herself, reminders about the ethics of citation, the right phrasing for a methodology section, the names of people who had helped. She learned also to accept help that came without strings. Edson's workshop, the Foundation's quiet grant, Jeanette's mentorship, without letting these gifts erase the labor that had preceded them. The ledger had to remain hers. There were moments in those months when the question of identity stirred in small, private ways. Students who once assumed they had her measure sometimes grazed her with a glance of new calculation. People tried, in offhand conversation, to fit her into neat boxes: scholarship student, adopted daughter of a donor, rising researcher, novelty. Sofia refused those tidy folders. The truth of her life resisted being reduced. Once, on an afternoon that smelled of rain, Flavio paused a corridor near the lab, and almost as if debating his courage, said, "Sofia." She paused as well, expecting a sentence of formality. "I wanted to say," he began, and then stopped. He offered no public apology, only a single sentence that held a confined sort of clarity. "I underestimated you." It was small. It mattered not because it was grand, but because it was a calibration. She accepted it without fanfare, and without letting it be a measure of her worth. Near the end of the academic year, the department organized a modest symposium on methodology. Sofia was asked to be a panelist alongside graduate students and a visiting scholar. She sat on the stage and spoke, without drawing attention to her biography, about the necessity of making process legible. She told a small anecdote, not about being mocked or adopted, but about how a morning spent scrubbing a bench taught her to notice detail. The attendees listened. There was no need for flourish. The work spoke as it always had. That night, after the symposium, Edson sent a short email that read like an institutional handshake. "We would like to include you in a summer research cohort." He offered practical details, dates, objectives, funding. The cohort would meet in a separate building without fanfare and work on refining empirical projects. It was an offer that would keep her labor central and her agency intact. The summer program changed her life less by grandeur than by accretion. She learned to code more effectively, to format a paper for submission, to present a poster and answer questions without shrinking. She traveled for the first time to a conference that was far enough away to feel like a small rupture of the daily pattern. Vera sewed a new set of shirts for the trip and ironed them with the care of a ritual, insisting that appearances did matter, if only because they helped others take you seriously. They both laughed at the small indulgence of a new shirt. On the final day of the cohort, they were invited to a modest reception. Mara from the Foundation appeared, and Edson introduced her as a collaborator. She shook Sofia's hand and smiled in the same calm way she had months before in the alcove. No cameras, no press releases, only a cup of coffee and polite conversation. "You are doing good work," Mara said. "I'm glad things found their balance." Sofia thought then of a different possibility. The way a person's life can be folded into itself and still hold anything at all. She thought of the ledger, the quiet, patient proof of days arranged in order, and of a mother whose hands had taught her that dignity is an action, not a title. Years later, enough years that they could be called a future rather than a next step, Sofia would sometimes think about that period as a hinge. She completed her degree with a thesis that carried her name and her signatures and a modest set of acknowledgements. She published an article in a small but respectable journal. She accepted a position as a research assistant that paid a decent wage and offered time to continue her own studies. Vera kept working at the university for a little longer, then shifted to a daytime role that gave her fewer late shifts and more rest. She traded very early mornings for a route that allowed her to start the day after the sun rose. She kept her cleaning cart polished, as if it were a standard of pride rather than a burden. When she walked through the atrium, donors read their papers and sometimes looked up at the same name plaque that bore the Moretti name. She did not need to notice those brass letters. She noticed the way the new plants in the courtyard had grown and the quiet improvements the administration had made to staff facilities. Those were the things that mattered to her, conditions that honored the labor of people who kept the place running. One evening, as the sun set and the campus lights hummed on, Sofia and Vera walked past the atrium. The strap of Sofia's bag was no longer thin and frayed, but still bore the memory of long use. The cleaning cart gleamed like a herald, and Vera pushed it with a careful rhythm. They walked slowly, sharing a silence that meant everything. "You kept your ledger," Vera said, as if reciting a simple fact. Sofia smiled. "We kept our ledger," she answered. She thought of the page where she had once written reasons to quit and crossed them out. She thought of all the small decisions and insistences that had knotted together. She thought of the moment Mara had revealed the private thread of Moretti's concern. It had not bought her voice. It had simply been another pair of hands that held open a door, hands that respected process. They stopped at the corner where the light fell warm and a new bench had been installed. Patricia was there, studying a list of references. Diego waved. Jeanette and Edson passed with a stack of papers that seemed full of possible projects. The campus was the same and not the same. It held both the old hierarchies and the new practices, an evolving terrain. Sofia rested her hand on her notebook and closed it gently, as if closing a small book after a long reading. She did not feel triumphant in a way that demanded display. She felt aligned. She felt recognized in the specific manner that mattered most, by the ledger she had kept and by the people who had attended to facts rather than rumor. Justice, when it came, had come as process, not vindictive spectacle. It had come because witnesses had spoken, because dates existed on paper, because the institution could still, if imperfectly, correct itself. Before they left, Vera turned to her daughter and said, "What will you do next?" Her voice made the question small, but vast at the same time. Sofia looked at the campus lights, then at the cleaning cart, then at the soft edge of the notebook she carried like an insignia. "I will keep working," she said. "I will keep the ledger. I will help others do the same when I can." They walked on in the hush of evening, the atrium behind them glowing softly. The world did not change in a single moment. It adjusted in small, steady increments. The teacher who had mocked her learned, in his own required way, that words matter. The student who had stolen credit learned that doing the work meant nothing without integrity. The institution learned that process and documentation are not bureaucracy, but instruments of fairness. Sofia, years later, would still keep a copy of the letter that cleared her, and she would keep a small, folded scrap of thin index paper in the back of her notebook, the anonymous threat that had once told her to keep her head down. She kept it not as proof of danger, but as a reminder of the cost of speaking, of the tenacity it required, and of the fact that being seen often comes slowly. If anyone ever asked why she had continued on a path that required so much stubbornness in the face of small cruelties, she would answer with a simple sentence she had once written in the margins: "Dignity is not given, it is accounted for." She believed that then, and she believed it still. If this story moved you, share it with someone who cares about fairness. Subscribe for more stories of quiet resilience and the small, steady ways people reclaim their dignity.